Angelica C. Rivera, BS Social Studies, and I am going to explain the theories of economic growth and development. Different models of economic growth stress alternative causes of economic growth. The principal theories of economic growth include: number 1, mercantilism, wealth of nation determined by accumulation of gold running trade surplus. Number 2, classical theory, Adam Smith placed emphasis on the role of increasing returns to scale or economies of scale specialization. Number 3, neoclassical theory, growth based on supply side factors such as labor productivity size of the workforce, factor inputs. Number 4, endogenous growth theories, rate of economic growth strongly influenced by human capital and rate of technological innovation. Keynesians demand side or Keynes argued that aggregates demand could play a role in influencing economic growth in the short and medium terms. Though most growth theories ignore the role of aggregates demand, some economists argued recession can cause hysteresis effect and lower long-term economic growth. Number 6, limits to growth. From an environmental perspective, some argue in the very long term economic growth will be constrained by resource degradation and global warming. This means that economic growth may come to an end, reminiscent of Malthus' theories. Mercantilism is a popular at the start of Industrial Revolution. Mercantilism isn't really theory of economic growth, but argued that country could be made better off by seeking to accumulate gold and increasing export. Classical model, developed by Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations in 1776. Smith argued there are several factors which enable increased economic growth. Number 1, rule of markets in determining supply and demand. The productivity of labor, Smith argued income per capita was determined by the state of skill, dexterity, and judgment with which labor is applied in any nation. Number 3, rule of trade in enabling greater specialization. Number 4, increasing returns to scale. Example, specialization we see in modern factories and the economies of scale of increased production. Ricardo and Malthus developed the classical model. This model assumed technological change was constant and increasing inputs could lead to diminishing returns. This led to the gloomy prediction of Malthus that the population would grow faster than the world's capacity to feed itself. Malthus underpredicted the capacity of technological improvements to increase food yields. Neoclassical model of Swan. The neoclassical theory of economic growth suggested that increasing capital or labor leads to diminishing returns. Therefore, increasing capital has only a temporary and limited impact on increasing the economic growth. As capital increases, the economy maintains its steady state rate of economic growth. To increase the rate of economic growth, in the Solo or Swan model, we need an increase in proportion of GDP or gross domestic product that is invested. However, this is limited as higher proportion of investment leads to diminishing returns and convergence on the steady state of growth. Technological progress, which increase productivity of capital or labor. It suggests poor countries who invest more should see their economic growth converge with richer countries. Criticism of this neoclassical or exogenous model, it doesn't explain why countries have different levels of investment as percent of GDP or gross domestic product. Some developing countries don't attract higher level of investment because of structural problems such as corruption, lack of infrastructure. It doesn't explain how to improve rates of technological progress. Harold-Domar model, saving ratio and investment. The Harold-Domar model is a type of neoclassical model. It states growth rates depends on a function of the saving rates. Some growth theorists place a large emphasis on increasing domestic savings. Savings provide the necessary funds to finance investment. It is this investment which creates further growth. This has been an important factor behind the economic growth in Asia. However, it depends on how efficient the investment is. If saving is too high, it leads to lower growth because people cannot afford to. New economic growth theories or endogenous growth. Endogenous growth models developed by Paul Romer and Robert Lucas placed greater emphasis on the concept of human capital. How workers with greater knowledge, education, and training can help to increase rates of technological advancement. They place greater importance on the need of governments to actively encourage the technological innovation. They argue in the free market classical view, firms may have no incentive to invest in new technologies because they will struggle to benefit in competitive markets. The model placed emphasis on increasing both capital and labor productivity. States that increasing labor productivity does not have diminishing returns but may have increased returns. They argue that increasing capital doesn't not necessarily leads to diminishing returns as Solow predicts. They say it is more complicated. It depends on the type of capital investment. Increased importance of spillover benefits from a knowledge-based economy. Its emphasis is placed on free markets, reducing regulation and subsidies. The argument is that we need to keep economies open to the forces of change. Joseph Schumpeter argued that an inherent features of capitalism was the creative destruction. Allowing inefficient firms to fail was essential for allowing resources to flow to more efficient channels. The Unified Growth Theory, developed by Oded Galor, Unified Growth Theory tries to combine many different elements of economic growth. Economic stagnation that characterized most of human history until the 18th century. First Industrial Revolution and the beginning of economic growth. The rule of human capital. Formation in economic growth, explaining divergence in economic growth across countries. And economic growth for developing countries. Other theories have been suggested for developing countries. Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz. The Malthus prediction is argued that economic growth may have limitation caused by lack of raw materials, climate change, and overcrowding. Even the failures of the Malthus prediction to come true, these theories are often rubbish. Nevertheless, there may come a time when growth is constrained by environmental factors. So, undertaking an evaluation of what government can learn from economic theory about raising their economy's long-term growth rate. The long-term growth rate depends upon the underlying trend rates of economic growth rate. This underlying trend rate of growth depends primarily on the growth of aggregate supply and production. To increase the long-term growth rate, aggregate demands plays a very limited role. In the classical model of economic growth, an increase in AD would only cause inflation. However, you can argue that 80-step rule to play. If an economy experiences a recession for a long time, the average long-run growth rate will be lower. This is related to the theory of hysteresis. Was what happened in the past is likely to happen in the future. Thus, if government can manage aggregate demand, they can prevent recessions and help increase the average growth rates. Apart from that, different theories of economic growth stressed. Rule of savings by Harold Domar, rule of capital investment, classical model, rate of technological improvements, endogenous growth and others, human capital, endogenous growth and unified growth, institutional factors, the openness of market, or endogenous growth, and classical model. The theory focuses on three factors that impact economic growth: the labor capital and technology, or more specifically, technological advancement. Economists studies theories and technologies useful for developing policies in government, as they have a deep understanding of how to create efficient